Hi, this is Simon from Tokyo Productions and welcome back to part 3 of this camera projection tutorial. Now, if you've been following along, you'll know that it's not camera projection as such, but you'll also probably have discovered that it can be every bit as effective. So in part 1 we looked at creating this alleyway scene. In part 2 we looked at this more advanced technique for dealing with more complicated shots, and in this third part we're going to be looking at constructing a 3D object from a flat 2D still. And as a bonus feature, we'll be looking at adding some volumetric lighting to this alleyway scene. So let's get started on this. I've got a new project here. It's 1920 1080. Frame rate doesn't matter, nor does the size. So let me come over to my file browser, and I'm going to give you a link to this image file that I've created for you. So let's bring that in. It's called Dumpster, and you can see that's pretty sexy as images go. So this is a flat 2D image of a dumpster. Let's just add a camera and see what happens if we try to fly around it. So if we rotate on Y, we can see that really doesn't work at all. So how do we turn this into 3D? Well, we're essentially going to be using a variant of the techniques we've already looked at. And this is extremely useful if you want to populate your scene with 3D objects to give it a bit of extra realism. So the first thing we want to do, as we did in our corridor scene in part 2 of this tutorial, is to set up some 3D geometry that we can use as a guide for constructing our 3D dumpster. So I'm going to urge you to customize your keyboard so you can easily switch views using the keyboard rather than having to use this menu. So to do that, come over to Motion, Commands, Customize. What I've done is I've used Control and Option. So I click on both of those, and let's type 3D View so we can see. I've mapped everything so far, but I haven't mapped 3D View back, so let me just show you how to do that. I'm going to map that onto the K key because I've already used B for the bottom. So let's just drag that onto the K key, and now that that's mapped. So what I've done is I've mapped F for front, B for bottom, K for back, L for left, and so on. So I advise you to do that. It just saves time and makes this whole process a lot more fluid. Okay, so let's save that and let's close it. So let's go back to creating our 3D geometry. We're going to come to Object, New Group. Let's move that to the top for the time being. I'm going to select the Rectangle tool, and I'm going to come to Window, Show HUD so I can set it up. We want a width of 1 and make sure that outline is on, fill is off, and just select a color that's sufficiently different from your foreground image. So now I'm going to draw a shape that matches the left-hand side of my dumpster. Doesn't have to be too accurate at this point. That's pretty good. So this will be the side, so let's call it side. I'm just going to select the anchor point tool, and with our overlays turned on, let's zoom right in, and let's just set that anchor point on the right-hand edge of that box I've just created. And then what we can do is we can right-click Duplicate. We can call this Front. Let's come to Properties. Let's come to the Y rotation and set that to 180 degrees. And that's flip that over, so we've now got something that we can use for the front. Let's switch to the Transform tool, and let's drag that out to something like the width of what we imagine the front of our dumpster would actually be. Now imagine you were doing this in a real world scenario and you had an object that you were shooting that you then wanted to recreate in 3D. I would strongly recommend that you took along your tape measure and you got yourself dirty and measured the various dimensions of your dumpster so that you can use those relative sizes to set up your 3D mesh absolutely precisely. Here obviously I'm guessing about the depth to some degree, and to a much larger degree I'm guessing about the width of the front. It's not too important in this case, but just something to bear in mind. Okay, so then I'm going to come back to my side here, and I'm going to switch to Edit Points. First, I want to zoom in, and I just want to adjust this top corner here. So I'm going to select that, hold down the Shift key and drag it up, just so it's defining the left-hand side all the way up to the top there. And let's just check that we're good at the bottom. Yes, that's good. And then what we want to do is we want to flip it so it's genuinely in 3D space. So let's come to the Y rotation and go for -90. Now let's duplicate it to make the other side. So right click, duplicate, and let's call this side far. And let's come to the properties, and let's scroll in the X position field till we're over there on the side. Okay, and then we just need to construct our back face. So let's select the front, right click, duplicate. Let's call this back. So to line this up, we need to switch to our top view, I think. So let's hit Control-Alt-T, which is what I've mapped it to. Or you could use the menu here, but I shall be using these shortcuts and I shan't be describing them just to save a bit of time. So switching to the top view gives us that. And we just need to move this plane back in Z till it matches up with those corners there. Let's switch to our front view, Control-Alt-F, and then I want to select my anchor point tool, drag that down to the bottom corner here so I can scale it correctly, and come to my Y scale and just drag that up till it's matching the back corners there. And now if we switch to our camera view, let's turn off the reference image and we rotate our camera through Y, you can see we've got our 3D guide. Okay, make sure to cancel out that camera rotation and let's turn our image back on again. So we need to duplicate it 3 times to get our side, our front and our top. So let's right click, duplicate, right click, duplicate, right click, duplicate, and let's lock the bottom layer just so we can keep that as a reference. But we'll turn that off for now also. So let's name these various elements, front, side, top, and let's turn off everything except the side. So what's useful here is to make sure that our anchor point is on this edge here, and I've set up the artwork so that it in fact is, but if it's not, then just adjust the anchor point so it matches up with our 3D guide. Okay, first of all let's name this guide group and just hide it for the time being. And what I want to do is I want to mask out that side. So what I'm going to do is select it, come to the Bezier Mask tool. Let's click down here. Let's click up here. Let's click here. I just want to keep in that little bit of a hinge up there. And just so we're masking out that area there. Okay, so this is our side. And we want to make it match up to the geometry. So let's turn the geometry back on again. First of all, we need to set this group here to 3D. So let's right click, make 3D group, and let's call this dumpster. And then we want to rotate this side so it's sitting on the left-hand side of the geometry. So select the side, come to its Y rotation, and enter a value of -90. And that's disappeared, but not if we switch to our left view. We don't need to make too many adjustments, we just need to adjust this bottom left-hand corner. So first of all I want to adjust the crop, so select the crop tool and I'm going to crop it in to the edges of our image. It'll help with the final adjustments. So then I'll switch to the distort tool and I just need to make a very small adjustment, as you can see, just to pull down this bottom left-hand corner. So I'll just bring that down like so, and we could possibly just adjust that top left. That should do. So we can switch back to the main camera view, and if we rotate the camera you can see how well that's now sitting on the side of our geometry. Okay, let's do the same thing with the front. So let's hide the side, let's turn on the front. First of all we need to select the Bezier Mask tool and we need to cut out the front. So we'll come along here, There we go, we've got our front cut out. Let's switch back to the crop tool, and again let's just crop it in so it's just the bit of the image that we require. So now let's switch to our front view, and let's select the distort tool, and let's grab this right hand edge and drag it along like so. And then I just want to square off the bottom edge like so. Okay, so now we can switch back to our camera view, turn on our side, just have a quick check of how that's looking. Okay, let's zero out the camera again. Let's do the same thing with our top. Turn off the other two sides. Let's again select the Bezier Mask tool and just want to very tidily cut out the top area. I'm going to have to sacrifice those hinges at the top. We could use them, but it would make this a little bit too complicated, and I don't want to overburden you with detail. So I'm just going to use that to cut out a very tidy shape for the top. So then I want to select that top layer and the crop tool, and again let's just crop it in like so, and finally select the anchor point tool, and I want to adjust that so it's sitting just there on the center of the front edge. So at the moment this image is front on to us when we're looking from the front, and that's not how it ought to be orientated at all. So I'm going to switch to the left hand view, and you'll realize obviously at this point that we need to rotate it so it's lying along the top of the dumpster. So we can just rotate the X value like that, and then we can also bring it down on Y. I happen to know that the right X value here is minus 74.4, so I won't waste time fiddling around, I'll just type that in. Okay, so now we can switch to the top view and carry out our lineup process. So we could do all of this with the distort tool as we've done before, but I'm going to make life a little bit simpler by using the X shear just to square us up, just and get us started. Then I'm going to move it across on X so that our anchor point is centered up, and I might also just use the Y shear as well just to square us up a little bit more with the front. And at this point I can switch to my distort tool. We can drag up this top edge and we can square it up. This might take a little bit of fiddling, so I'll speed this part up. So there we go, we're lined up pretty well, and we can switch back to our camera view. And we can turn on our other two faces. Let's take our camera and just rotate ourselves around in Y a little bit. Just going to do one little thing just to soften off these edges, and that's to take all of these masks, command click them to select them all. I'm going to come to the mask properties here, and I'm going to set a feather value of 4. And that's just going to help to blend those in a little bit more. Probably won't see it, but I promise you it does actually help. And now let's add a light just to see how it's all looking. New light. And as I move that around, you can see we've very much got a convincing 3D object that was worth that little bit of effort to build. Now let me turn the light off and explain that although this is looking pretty good, there are certain limitations to it. If we were simply moving the camera in X, Y, or Z, this object is pretty much good to go as is. However, you'll notice that if we animate the Y value, something very funky is happening with our left hand side. It appears to sort of get sucked into the edge of the object. And the reason for that is obviously we haven't built any 3D geometry for this left hand side. We've just left that original image as is, and it's not looking correct for that Y rotation. Well, to fix that we're going to have to do quite a bit more work, but I think it's going to be work that's well worthwhile. Let me just turn the guide back on again, and I want to add an extra bit of guide for this crossbar here. So I'm going to switch to my left hand view, and I'm going to come to my side, and I'm going to duplicate that, and I'm just going to come to edit points, and I'm going to bring those down just to define this sidebar here. Bearing in mind that this section here isn't actually part of the object, it's just due to the perspective on the image. So we're really just going to select this area here that we want to identify as our bar. So now let's switch to the camera view. I want to duplicate this and I want to move it a little bit out on X like that, so it's defining the outside edge of the bar. If I turn the dumpster off and we just rotate the camera a little bit, you can see how that guide geometry is working. So let's turn the dumpster back on again. Let's turn the guide off for the time being. I'm going to come to my left-hand view, and what I want to do is I want to eliminate this extraneous artwork here, because this doesn't really exist in real life, this section here. So I'm going to select the side. I'm going to select the rectangle mask tool. I'm going to draw a rectangle mask there, come to the mask controls, set the mask blend mode to subtract, so that subtracts that from the main object, and let's just feather it by about 4 pixels, or maybe even 6 pixels, and maybe just move it out a bit so we've got a nice tidy edge there. So now what I want to do is hide the areas of this background image that comprise this bar and these fins, so I can rebuild it. So I'm going to take that side layer and duplicate it. And I'm going to remove the image masks from it. And I'm also going to come to its properties and undo that 4-corner transform. And I'm going to come to the crop tool, turn on the overlays, and let's just crop down like this till we get that object more or less isolated. And let's come to the Bezier Mask tool, and let's just draw out the center area of that bar. Just want an area of flat color without any obvious shading in it. So let's take this and let's now transform it. Drag it upwards, drag it downwards, move it across, just adjust it so it's covering our background quite substantially. And then we could come to the Bezier Mask and feather it like that, but it's going to feather my left and right as well as my up and down, and I don't want that. So I'm going to come to the library, filters, blur, Gaussian blur, and I'll add that to the Bezier Mask. I'll come to the inspector, I'll zero out the horizontal, and I'm just going to increase the vertical just so it blends that shape better into the background. So obviously you're better off doing this kind of work in a dedicated image processing program like Photoshop, but this will do for the purposes of this tutorial. Okay, I'm just going to call this layer fill so we know what we have here. I'm going to turn it off momentarily, and I want to do 2 things. I want to cut out this fin and I want to cut out the bar. So let's start with the fin, I think so. Take this layer and let's duplicate it. So right click, duplicate. Let's kill the existing masks again and let's call this fin. Let's take our Bezier Mask tool and let's draw around the fin. I do want to include quite a bit of the outside rather than going too tight on it. So this I think is going to work quite well. So I just want to come over to the anchor point tool, and you see that anchor point is way over there and I don't want that. I want it to be on the edge just here. And then I want to select the fin, come to properties, and I want to rotate it. And I want to basically cancel out that Y rotation that we originally put in. If I now come to my camera view and we turn our fill back on again and I move that fin above it, and if we rotate the camera, you can see that's actually working quite nicely. Right, we need 3 of these in total, so let's turn off the fill just so we can see how it's all working. Select the fin, right click, duplicate, and come to properties, and let's just adjust the Z transform so that moves that across to the center there. Let's duplicate it again, Again, let's come to the Z transform, and we want to position this one right at the back, and we can turn our fill layer back on again just to check how that's working. And where's our camera? There we go. So those fins are working quite nicely now, and we just need to add in the bar again. So let's turn off the fill again. Let's come to our left view, and again we want to duplicate our side element. So right click, duplicate. Let's bring it to the top of the dumpster group. Let's delete its masks again, because we just want to isolate the bar. So let's select it, let's come to the Bezier Mask tool, and let's isolate that front face of the bar, like this. Then let's turn back on our 3D guide, just to help us line that up. And so we can move it out a bit. Let's actually turn off the background side, because it's not helping us at this point. What I think I'd like to do is crop it down so we're not having to worry about all that extra area there. So let's enable the crop tool, crop it up from the bottom, crop it down from the top, and zoom in again. The bottom left needs to come down just a fraction. The top right needs to come up just a fraction. And now let's switch to the front view. And what we need to do is we need to align that to the edges of our fins. Zoom in a bit and adjust the X position just like that. So here we are back in our camera view, and if we now do that telltale rotation on Y to reveal the side, you'll see that we've sorted that problem out. However, if I turn my light back on again and we come to the light properties and enable shadows, you'll see one issue, which is that we're seeing through the bar at the top there. Although it's not something we can see from the camera view, the light is telling us that we can see through the bar. So we just need to make an object that obscures the light. So let's turn the light back on, off again just for 1 second. I'm going to take that final side that I've made and I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to come to its transform and I'm going to rotate it through 90 degrees on X. And then I'm going to come to my top view and I just want to move it out on X till we hit the edge of our guide there. And I also want to look at the front view. We just want to check the height of that. Let's bring it down to there. So it's just at the top of the fins. And switch back to our camera view and turn our light back on again. You'll see that sorted that problem out. And now we've got completely realistic shadows there. We can really do anything we want with this model. So this has been a really long process, I know, but I think that's really worthwhile. I think to be able to get a nice looking 3D object like that you can play around with, it's worth a bit of extra effort to get there. So now that we've finished our build, I wanted to point out something that you've probably worked out for yourself already. And that's that if you were photographing this dumpster yourself for use with this technique, the best thing you could do is to photograph it from each angle. So you'd come round to the left-hand side and you'd shoot as near as possible something that looked like that. And you'd come round to the front and so forth. And the advantage of that is that not only is it much easier to fit the separate elements to your geometry, you'll also get better resolution in the end because you're not distorting the picture quite so much and you've got much more information. And equally well, if you've only got one angle, we don't know what the far side of the dumpster looks like and we don't know what the back looks like, but if we'd taken the trouble to shoot them, we could add them in very easily. So just think about doing that. When I've done camera projection in the real world, not using this technique but using the classic camera projection technique, that's exactly what I've done. I've shot every single face of the object and it makes life so much easier. So there's a couple of extra things I wanted to do just before we import this back into our original scene. One of which is to duplicate the side here and put it at the back there just in case we see through the lid for any reason. So I'm going to duplicate that side. Right click, duplicate, Come to the properties. I'll switch to the front view for this, and then I'm just going to move this over on X so it's sitting at our right hand edge. Okay, so that's one thing we want to do, and the other of which is to create some occlusion for the base of the dumpster and also for the back where it meets the wall. So I'm going to select the rectangle tool, and then I'm going to switch to the top view, and I'm just going to check my HUD, and I've got a wacky fill color, and that's deliberate so that I can see exactly what I'm doing. So I'm going to draw out a rectangle that exactly matches my top view, like so, and then I'm going to switch back to my camera view. Just need to bring that down on Y till we start to see it at the base there, just somewhere like that. And I want to feather it out just a little bit, so I'm going to feather it out by 15 pixels, maybe 25 in fact, just enough so we see a little bit of it at the base. And when this is black, it'll look like that contact shadow or occlusion that you'd get in reality. And we need to do the same thing for the back, so I'm going to duplicate this layer, right click duplicate, come to its properties, let's close down the HUD. I'm going to zero out that X rotation, and then I'm going to come to my front view. I'm going to move it up on Y till we just clears the floor, and then looking at my overlays, I'm going to scale it up vertically, so we're just at the back there, just peeking out over the back. And then I want to come to edit points, and I just want to add some points here just where the handles are. So holding down the Alt key, click there, another one there, another one there, another one there. Take these 2 points, holding on the Shift key, I'm going to move them out again so it just clears that handle there. Switch back to the camera view. Just need to switch to the left hand view. We need to move that obviously to the back there on Z, just to clear that hinge area there. And switch back to my camera view. This will work much better when we see it in situ, so don't worry about the color just at this point. Okay, and the final thing I want to do is I want to adjust the anchor point for the overall dumpster group. So let's select the anchor point tool and make sure our overlays are on, and I want to make sure it sits down at this bottom front corner here. So I'm going to bring it down to there. So just if we needed to scale it for any reason, we'll scale it up from the floor, and it's much easier to handle that way. Okay, I think we're done and we're ready to switch over to our other scene. So let's copy this dumpster group, right click copy, and let's switch to our original scene. And let's come to the top here and select paste, and that'll bring our dumpster into our scene. Let's come back to our first frame, come to the dumpster properties. Now I want to move the dumpster down behind the effects group, so I'm going to select object, send backward, and that'll position it behind all this nice smoke and fog. And I want to position the dumpster at -540 on Y, because I happen to know that I've set my original floor at 540 pixels. I also want to rotate it through 90 degrees on Y, and I'll send it back on Z -1750. And then I just want to move it over on X, and I'll know when I've gone too far because my background occlusion will disappear. So there you go, that's about right. And then I want to select these 2 rectangles which are forming my occlusion layers, and come to their fill color, and let's set that down to black. So now that's sitting in my scene fairly nicely. Right, we've gone to all this trouble to build our 3D dumpster, and our lighting is not really doing it justice. So I want to come to my lighting group. I want to select all the lights apart from the distant one, and I want to move them on Z. So I'm going to scroll on Z till that foreground light just hits the front of the dumpster there. And that makes for a better effect, I think. So the colour of the dumpster doesn't really match the rest of the scene, and I'm going to do something that I don't normally do, and that's use one of my plugins that is available commercially under the Hawaii brand, and it's called Hawaii Automatch. and I'm going to add it to the dumpster group. And I'm going to come to the inspector. I'm going to select the reference colour as being this dark tower at the back here, and the destination I'm going to select my lid of my dumpster there, and then I'm going to hit enable, and I'll dial that down just a little bit, and then I'll open up the fine-tune section and I'll come down to the mid-range and I'll darken it down, and that's just helping to put it into the scene much better. It saves me a lot of extra effort. And what that's done, and you can probably just about see it here on this effect in the foreground, is it's changed the order of operations of these various layers. So what I need to do is I need to take this layer here, which is my smooth smoke, and I need to move it down behind the dumpster because it thinks it's in front at the moment. So I'm going to move it in there, and that'll put it behind the dumpster, and then when we come forward we get that nice reveal of it behind, and that looks quite nice. Now there is one other thing that's important to remember, and that's the shadow properties of the lights. So I'm going to select those bottom two lights, the ones that are nearest the dumpster, and I'm going to turn on their shadows, and you'll see the difference is that those fins don't get artificially illuminated as though the light is coming through the geometry, so that's a much more effective look. But for this final part of this tutorial, I want to adjust the lights because I want to show you something a little bit different from camera projection, and that's to look at volumetric lighting coming through one of these windows. So let me move back a little bit, and I want the light to come through this window over here on the right and throw a beam across the alleyway onto the dumpster. So I'm going to select the light that's nearest to us, and temporarily I'm going to move it to minus 1100 to get us in the ballpark, and I'm going to turn off the light that comes next just to give us a little bit more drama. And this first light I'm going to adjust the fall off, and I think I'll come down to 10, and you can see that's now illuminating the dumpster. We're seeing a little bit more of that edge detail, which is we've spent so much time working on. Right, and this light is looking like it's probably coming from somewhere around here. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn off everything except for my right hand wall. So we're left with that, and that's including the lights. So this is just to simplify things a little bit. Then I'm going to come to this right hand wall, I'm going to open it up, I'm going to select the layer inside, and I'm going to click on this little rectangle here with the dot in the middle, and I've no idea what it's called, but it's a very handy way of isolating that layer without any of its transforms. So that gives us this, and I'm going to zoom in onto this window that I want to work with, and I'm going to select the Bezier Mask tool, and I just want to draw a mask for the inside of that window. A little bit hard to see. Something like this. There we go. And then what I'm going to do is I want to make sure to come out of this mode by clicking on that button again. And then I want to duplicate this right hand group. So right click, duplicate. And this top layer I'm going to call right wall. And the back one I'm going to call right window. And then I'm going to come to the Bezier mask for the right wall, and I'm going to hit the invert mask switch, and we're back to square one. I'll come to the right window group, come to its properties, and I'm going to set its X position to 980 and just moves it away a little bit. I've now opened up a little bit of a gap there, and what I'm going to do is just adjust the Z position a bit so that comes back into position. There we go. Next I want to make a new group above the right wall group. So select the right wall group, come to Object, New Group. Then I want to switch to my left hand view, like so. And I'm going to zoom into this window again. I can see that a bit better. I'm going to select the rectangle tool. I'm going to come to Window, Show HUD. I want a white fill and no outline. And then I'm just going to draw a rectangle up here. And for some reason that doesn't draw it quite in place. Little bug there, I think. I'm just going to move it into the middle of that, and I'm going to scale it up a bit. Just in this area of this top window pane here. And then I'm going to select the Edit Points tool. Turn on, make sure the overlays are turned on, and just make a little bit of an adjustment to that so it's sitting within that area of that top pane. Don't need to worry too much about my right hand edge. I want it to overlap with this pipe because I'm going to move it backwards eventually. And then I want to hold down the Alt key and just drag that down so I can take care of this next pane down and just make another adjustment to the edit points there. Do the same thing again, hold down the Alt key, drag it down, make another copy. Just fine tune those points, drag it down, make another copy, and fine tune the points. Like so. And when you're more or less happy with that, we'll switch back out to the camera view. Can't see anything, but that's because we need to select this group and we need to move it over on X back to where that window actually is in the X space, so 980 pixels. We'll move it back into position. Now if we select those rectangles and we change the opacity down to about 35 and we turn our lights back on again, you can see how that's working to look like an illuminated window. But that's only half the battle, so let's call this window light and let's duplicate that group. Right click, duplicate, and let's call this window rays. And then I'm going to take those layers and I'm going to return the opacity to 100%. I want to select the group, I want to come to the library, filters, blur, and I want to look for zoom blur, and I want to add it to that window rays group. I'm just going to turn off the lights while we set this up, and I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. I'm going to make sure my overlays are turned on. I'm going to grab the zoom blur widget or whatever it's called, and I'm going to move it over to roughly here, just where that pipe is. And I'm going to come to the inspector and I'm going to increase the amount, and as you see as I do so, that stretches out these rays, and I can fine-tune how they fall just by moving that zoom blur widget like so. Now if we look through the animation, you'll see that that changes depending on the position of the camera, and that's not quite right. So what we'll need to do is we'll need to keyframe the position of this zoom blur center. So let's set a keyframe there at 1 second, which is where it'll turn itself on. And then let's come to a point at which it's starting to disappear, and we need to move it out to where that would have been if we could still see it. So it's somewhere like that, I think. And now that stays more or less in the right position. It's probably not that critical, and that looks pretty good to me. So now I'm going to turn everything back on again and see how we're looking. So we've got a problem here in that the rays look like they're being chopped off. So we can fix that by selecting that window rays group, coming to Object and selecting Bring to Front. And that solves the problem of those rays disappearing. And finally, I just want to tweak the position of that light so it's having the best effect. First of all, I'm going to just turn off Render Shadows because that's slowing us down just a little bit. I'm going to come to the lights group, I'm going to find that light, there it is, turn on the overlays so we can see where it is. We need to move it down on Y and move it over on X, and that's looking really quite good, I think. So we just need to turn Render Shadows back on again and go for a final render. So here we go, this is what it all looks like, and I'm pretty pleased with that. This has been another mammoth tutorial, but I hope it's given you some ideas about how to use your own stills to create 3D objects in motion. I think with a little bit of imagination you can really create some amazing scenes. And if you're an After Effects user, this technique will work just as well in After Effects and will probably be a lot easier and more adaptable than the standard camera projection method. So anyway, thanks very much indeed for watching, and I hope to see you again on the next one.